sir.
Thank you. Hello again, Mark.
Hello again, Mark. We had the pleasure of speaking with Mark this morning for our show, and again, we want to start sort of at the beginning. Why did you feel it necessary to write another book about the Beatles and the history of the Beatles? So many have been written.
Well, there are so many books. I don't know how many people here have Beatle books on their shelves, but I have about 500 at home. And myself, I've done half a dozen in the past, but they were all reference books. And most of the Beatles books are a niche area of the subject, and they look at it and they go quite deep on it. But they're quite specialist in that way. In terms of biography, there are still very few. And I didn't feel that any single biography had ever really covered the Beatles in the way that I wanted to read about it and in the way that I think their story demands and deserves. So I just decided that I would do it, but I would do it with a difference in that I would write about it deeply in 3 volumes. Because if you try and cram this story in all its many ramifications into one book, then you are going to have to leave out a lot of material that's absolutely necessary to the understanding. So the idea came up for this 3-volume series, and I was able to get a publisher in the UK and here in the US. Thank you to my team who are here today brilliantly. And they've been really patient because it took a while. But the idea is that this story, in my opinion, has never really been told properly before. And the idea is to press the refresh button on something that we think we know, and to actually look at it again from the top to the bottom, from the side to the side, every which way, and do it properly.
Now, we are at Google, so obviously we want to talk a little bit about research.
Yeah.
Because when a long time ago when people did their books, it was libraries and phone disks and no internet. You've had the good fortune of having the internet, but you've also done the old-fashioned way as well.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the research you did?
Well, I figure that if you only research your book on the internet, then by definition, you're not going to be able to get anything that is special and unique to you, because it will be something that has been found before, has been typed by someone and is up there because someone's put it up there. So obviously the internet is a phenomenal resource and we all use it, and it was a great help to me on this project in every way. But at the same time, you can't beat doing old-fashioned detective work and getting out there and burning shoe leather. And I burned shoe leather and car tires and whatever. I needed to go wherever the information was. And this story is now quite an old story. I mean, the book begins in the 19th century. But even when the book really begins to accelerate after they're born, the Beatles are all war babies, which is quite important to the story. When you're looking at 1940s and 50s and 60s resource materials, a lot of that is still not available on the internet. You have to go to the libraries, you have to go into the archives, and you have to do proper research. So it's a combination. I always say with this book, I go where the information is. If it's easily available, I'll grab it easily. If it's difficult to obtain, I'll go that extra mile.
So where was the information?
The information is in personal and private hands. It's in public archives and libraries. It's in corporate archives. It's in old newspapers and magazines and books and radio and television and film. It's whatever you need to go, or wherever you need to go and whatever you need to do. So a lot of time in the Liverpool Record Office, which is looking at birth records and school records in Liverpool, England. A lot of the time in the archives of the BBC or the archives of their record company, EMI. None of that stuff's been digitized, so you have to go to it. And in particular, archives of people who had an association with them, like lawyers who might have kept legal files, or broadcasters who kept files, all that kind of stuff.
Now, Mark, there's been so much written about the music. You've started way back with literally the birth of each of the individual members of the group. But when it comes to going back to Liverpool, you're relying on people's memories, you're relying on a combination of information that's been available, and as you say, newly discovered information. You found some conflict, of course, amongst all of this. So how did you work through all of the many, many conflicting stories about
Well,
the
the
Beatles?
Beatles is often the biggest thing that ever happened to someone in their life. If they had an association with the Beatles, you can imagine it's something that they talk about for forevermore. Most people, not all. And inevitably along the way, the stories begin to gather layers that weren't actually necessarily there in the first place. So one of the things that I can bring to a project like this is that I have a wealth of background knowledge. I've been doing this now for 30-odd years professionally.
Yeah.
So you have to know when people are talking bull, basically. And I have a very strong sense of that. And I won't use anything, no matter how exciting the story, if someone's telling me something that I know will look good on the page, but I don't quite believe it, I won't use it.
And what about
Because accuracy is absolutely everything to a book like this. There's no point in doing this again unless it's accurate.
Right.
what about the George Harrison quote that is in the book?
There's a quote in the book where George says, in their bid to tell what they know, some people tell more than what they know. And that is the same thing, stories become embroidered with time. And no, in an interview, even where I'm really comfortable with what someone's telling me as the truth, there'll still be something that I won't use. And there are some people I won't go to at all because I know what they're going to say, and I know it's unusable.
The script. They have a script.
It's a script, and some people actually have made a living out of putting themselves more centrally into a picture they were never in the first place.
Right.
Mark, you've been doing research on the Beatles for, like I said, over 30 years. Did you set up, when you would do interviews along the way, were you thinking about this book at this point? Because you obviously have a great archive of interviews with the Beatles themselves.
No, I didn't know I was going to be doing this until pretty much when I started it. So all the times in the past I've had access to people, I could have asked them certain things and didn't, but I didn't have that foresight. But this is very much a book of information, and when with Beatle collectors, I am a Beatle fan, but at the same time I'm an independent professional historian, so I have the enthusiasm of a fan to carry me through a long project like this, but I'm not interested in polishing their reputation in any way. So this is not a book saying, hey, weren't the Beatles great? This is an independent history, and it doesn't pull any punches. But it's essentially a book of information, and Beatle fans collect different things, and I, more than anything else, collect information. And I've had incredible access to archives through working for the Beatles for so long, and been in many good situations where I've had access to archives, and I always take the moment if I can, if there's an opportunity. So I have filing cabinets full of history, basically, and that's all going to go into these 3 books.
But we could add, though, that while the book is information, there's quite a bit of humor. And that is really wonderful. There's a great humorous aspect, partly because, as we've talked about, the Beatles themselves were...
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're just such funny guys. And their story always makes me laugh. I still laugh hysterically at most aspects of the Beatles. And it's really important that a book like this should have humor in it. And I'm glad that you noticed that.
Yeah.
How important is the fact that they're from Liverpool and not London or someplace else?
It's crucial. It's crucial. Liverpool, I mean, we live in a world now where rock music is everywhere. You can't avoid it. Even when you want to avoid it, you can't avoid it. But we're talking here, and this is a contextual history, so I'm writing about the 1950s and 60s, when rock music was the music of delinquents. And it was greatly frowned upon in mainstream society. Adults did not get it. It was not their music. They thought it was associated with hoodlums, and therefore they shunned it. And what was the question?
How important was the fact that the Beatles are from Liverpool?
Yeah, so we live in a world now full of rock music, and rock bands are everywhere. In those days, in the late 50s, early 60s, there was no real rock band scene anywhere in America. There had been some rock and roll, and the corporate America was trying to suppress it, to kill it off, with the payola scandal and all of that of the late 1950s. And it really survived primarily in England, where everybody in England, all the kids in England growing up who loved American music, they didn't want anything from England. It had to be American. And in England, there was really only one place where there was a scene, where there were bands forming, mates playing guitars, swapping chords, swapping songs, getting up on stage and singing. It wasn't London, it was Liverpool. It was the only place in the world, in other words, that had a rock band scene. And the Beatles initially, they weren't in the first wave of that. They were not there at its formative period. They joined it after 2 or 3 years it had been up and running. And when they got back from Germany the first time, which is another story, they took it over. And they were the kings very, very quickly. And they were different from everybody else because they were original. The Beatles always broke all the rules. They were always original. They were never tied by any convention. They thought differently. They looked different. They acted different. And they were the kings.
Well, they also played different songs from the other bands because they would often look at a B-side, let's say. Which is something you don't think about. Yeah. Because you'd want to play the A-side because everyone knew it.
Yeah, the Beatles didn't have iPlayers. Didn't have iPads or iPods or anything like that. They were in record shop listening booths, browseries they were called, and they would all squeeze themselves in and they would ask the assistant behind the counter to play this one, this one, this one, this one, whatever they picked that was from America. They only wanted to play American music. And they would be crowded into these browseries, and one of them very quickly would say something was crap, usually John, and they would take it off and they would put on the next one, and then Paul would say, I'll do this one. Or John would say, I'll do this one, or George would say, I'll do this one. And that's how they got a repertoire. But they looked for the unusual. So they went to the B-sides and they went for the really obscure tracks that no one else was even playing. Yeah. And they popularized a lot of American music that way that wasn't even popular here.
Yeah, and they actually, they made African-American music accessible here to white people in America, which was a very big thing for them. They were very proud of it because they were not into the segregation. And correct?
The Beatles' first album is principally a New York sound. It's the music of 1650 Broadway, properly known as the Brill Building, but actually that was across the street. It's the music of Jerry Goffin and Carole King and acts and songwriters like that, Burt Bacharach and Hal David. And that was the first album. The second album was really a Detroit sound. They were looking for the Motown sound, the Tamla Motown sound. And then they exploded in America and were able to give back to you the music that was yours in the first place, but often hadn't been heard before.
And they actually brought that music out of just the club scene by being the first to perform a Tamla Motown track on the BBC radio.
Yeah, that was interesting. The Beatles first appeared on the radio in England in a session before they actually had a recording contract. And one of the songs they played in their first broadcast was Please Mr. Postman by the Marvelettes on Tamla. And I thought, I wonder how many times that record or anything else from Tamla had been played on British radio before. So again, this is nothing digitized here. I spent days going through microfilm records, wearing out my eyes, turning the film round and round and round on all the BBC programme output records. So every record played in every radio show would be logged, and I went through the logs. And it turned out that my hunch was right. They were the first to play a Tamla sound from Detroit on BBC radio. And then in their next broadcast, they played a song, Ask Me Why, that was based on a Tamla record or inspired by a Tamla record. So that was also a first. They, I'm sure, didn't know any of this. They were just doing it. You know, it's down to the historian to come along and put it into context. But they were doing it. They were the first.
You know, let's go back in the past just a little bit. We've gone to the music, and we'll get back to that because we really need to find out how the Beatles did get their music. You had mentioned it a little bit, but let's go back to the childhoods because, again, you say the book is a social history with the Beatles at the center of it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about each Beatle briefly, about their childhood and musically what they had and such.
Okay, so starting with?
That boy, John Lennon.
Okay. John Lennon, John, Paul, and George, all the products of Catholic Protestant marriages, which is an unusual mix in Liverpool, which had a particularly strong religious divide. You would normally stick to your own religion. Most unusual that 3 of the Beatles actually have that mixed background, which I think is probably part of their makeup. I'm not quite sure what it says, but it's part of who they are. John Lennon was born in 1940 when Liverpool was being bombed by the Germans. Liverpool was very, very badly bombed by the Nazis in the Second World War. He wasn't born in an air raid, but all the same, there were bombs falling very close by within a day or two of where he was born. And he was born to a father who was a merchant seaman who was actually plying the Atlantic route with the U-boats lurking in the deep, so very risky job. And a mother, that was Alf Lennon, and his mother Julia. John's mother Julia Lennon was a very liberal woman in her time. They had married, but they didn't really ever have much of a relationship. There are no photographs of John Lennon's parents together, not from their wedding day or any of the years they were together. In fact, they weren't together very much. But Julia was unusual in that she was very attractive to men, and the fact that she was married didn't stop her from courting other men. And she had 4 children to 3 different men in 9 years, which sounds more like today's behaviour, if anything, than 1940s behaviour. Yes. Obviously marked her out as very unusual in her time. But they never really got the hang of bringing up their son together. And John was kind of passed from one to the other. When Alf was back, he would be, John would see his dad. Otherwise, he was with his mum, but the mum was mostly going out at night. So he was really raised by his auntie, his aunt and uncle, his Aunt Mimi and his Uncle George. And they gave him the stability that he needed. And in 1946, he became the guardian of his Aunt Mimi and Uncle George permanently.
And they also provided, I think, harmonica to him.
Yeah, he was. John's mother was very musical. She played ukulele, and John's father played harmonica. But I don't think John necessarily knew that. Okay. But he was very good musically. He had a natural musical talent, but he also had a great facility for words. He was writing really inventive comic poetry and doing lots of drawing from infancy onwards.
That was an influence of Mimi because she had been an avid reader.
Yeah.
And brought that to influence him in that way.
John Lennon was an avid reader his entire life. He would read a book or two a week and a newspaper or two every day, cover to cover. And he did that until the day he was shot. So he was always reading. And
what about Paul McCartney?
Paul, on his mother's side, there's not so much music there. She was a midwife. But on Paul's father's side, there was a lot of music. His dad actually had a band. And much as the Beatles were playing the Liverpool halls and club circuit in the 1960s, so his dad had been doing that 40 years earlier with Jim Mack's band. Jim McCartney had Jim Mack's band. He was the leader, and he played piano and trumpet, and wrote a tune. So Paul McCartney was not the first in his family to write a song. His dad wrote one before him. And actually his dad had been a musician as well, playing Northern England brass band music, which I don't think is so well known here, but very nice kind of brass music.
Now, Richie, I mean, we know him as Ringo, but throughout the book, for the most part, he's Ringo when we talk about him on stage, but he's Richie.
Yeah, there's no hindsight in this book, so I can't call him Ringo until he becomes Ringo. He's about 20 years old by then.
Right.
And similarly, I don't use the word Beatles anywhere until they actually come up with the name, because until that point, they're not Beatles.
Right.
So he's Richie Starkey.
Right. And good.
There's a little bit of music in his background, but not too much. But mostly it was family parties. Liverpool is a very musical city. It's another reason why they had a rock band scene there. And that's because Liverpool is a very musical place. It's the strongly Irish heritage there. People, you go to pubs, you sing. At a family party, everyone is expected in turn to have a turn. So it would come to your turn, and you would have to get up and read a piece of poetry or sing or whatever. And they all had these musical events in their background. But Richie, the biggest thing about his childhood is that he was seriously ill twice. On the first occasion, he was 7 years old. He very nearly died. 3 times his mother was told he wouldn't last the night. And poor woman, Richie was her only child, and she would have to go home on the bus from hospital thinking she'd never see him again. But he was always a tough little kid. Not necessarily physically, but emotionally, mentally, he is still a very tough guy, Ringo.
And didn't he also, at these parties after he was sickly and came home, he used to sing Nobody's Child?
Yeah, Richie liked country music from America. And whereas there is a bit of a myth that the Beatles always got their music from the sailors who sailed between New York and Liverpool, in reality, they actually got their records from shops, as I was saying. But Richie did have a bit of a supply line there, and he was into real American country music, which all started when he saw a Gene Autry film at the cinema when he was 9 or 10. And living where he did, which was Liverpool was a very poor city, but the area where Richie lived was about the poorest of them all. And they had nothing, and they had no prospects, and they had no heating, and they had no hot water. All these guys had outside toilets. Nobody had a toilet inside the house, let alone a bath. I mean, these things were completely unheard of. You would always have to go to a public bath to wash. So this was a very different way of growing up. And he saw Gene Autry on the screen singing South of the Border. And he wanted desperately to go to America, and tried to emigrate to Houston, Texas, when he was about 20 years old. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we didn't talk about George yet, but
Yeah.
we talked about George, and I have another question.
Okay. George doesn't really have much music in his background. His dad did get a guitar. His dad was a sailor as well, and he first came to New York in about 1927. So both John's father and Paul's father had been to New York, and obviously would talk about America to a degree at home. And George's father had bought a guitar, actually, in New York. But their times got tough in the 1930s, and the Depression had sold it. But what they had was American records. He brought back like Roy Rogers records, Singing Brakeman and all that kind of stuff. Jimmy Rogers, not Roy Rogers, I'm sorry, that's the cowboy, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Don't think he made a record.
No.
Roy Rogers did.
Oh, well, maybe he did, yeah.
Happy trails.
Happy Trails. Yes.
Oh, right, okay. So there was music around, and also there was the influence of some English music, like George Formby, who I don't know if anybody here has heard of George Formby, music hall star in England, who wrote and sang kind of very saucy songs, risque, double entendre songs. So they all had music to it to some degree or other.
Right.
Paul the most.
I want to talk about Brian Epstein. Here's a guy who he ran a record shop in his parents' store, and all of a sudden he becomes their manager, and he really sets a revolution off by the way he presented the Beatles and other bands too. It wasn't just the Beatles too.
Yeah.
How important is Brian Epstein going to the Cavern in November of 1961?
It's vital, because the Beatles, as I said, they were the hottest act in Liverpool, but that was all. There was no way out. How'd you get out of Liverpool? How'd you get down to London and get a recording contract and become famous? None of them had any idea how to do it. None of the people in London were looking up north, because London is always very insular, and people just think that if it's not happening there, it's not happening anywhere. So, but the music scene as we know it, the books I'm writing have to tell the story of how the music business, which was this quaint old thing that began in Tin Pan Alley in New York in the 1910s, how that became the record business, and how that crossed the Atlantic. And ultimately, through the Beatles, it became the music industry, with these vast billion-dollar companies like Google even, that control all these rights and find ways of bringing the music to the marketplace. This was just a very little thing when the Beatles were trying to get a recording contract, and it was the Beatles who actually made that revolution happen. So I must show in these books how the Beatles changed the music business, how they changed the entertainment business.
But Brian was very sure about them. Right away he knew something was going on.
So no one was there. Just as there was no group like the Beatles, and believe me, when the Beatles first tried to get a recording contract, one of the reasons they struggled is because no one like that had ever existed before. It sounds so simple. I got drums, bass guitar, lead guitar, rhythm guitar. One, two, or three guys, or even all four, who sing in harmony and write their own songs. God, it's everywhere now. Right. It was nowhere then, and it was so nowhere that no one could recognize that they were new and different. And similarly, Brian Epstein as manager was so different to any manager who had ever been before. And so Brian revolutionized rock management, and the Beatles revolutionized rock music. And he He was a young guy who was unfulfilled. He was struggling to find his way in life, in that he was very good as a businessman. He was good enough to be considered store management material at the age of 21. But he was never satisfied with doing any one thing. So he would start something with immense enthusiasm, and after a year he would get bored and go and do something else. He really wanted to be an actor. He really wanted to be a dress designer. He really wanted to direct plays on the stage. But he couldn't. Every time he tried one of those things, it never really worked. And he ended up dissatisfied back in Liverpool until he saw the Beatles. And he was able to bring to them all his ideas for presentation and all his organisation in terms of management administration. He was a brilliant administrator. One of the joys for me on this project, and we talk about how do you get information, is I was able to find Brian Epstein's management files for the Beatles. And that's all completely unseen stuff.
Wow.
And I have a very, very strong collection of this. It runs all the way through to his death in '67. Wow. And in fact beyond. And all that stuff is completely new, but what it tells me is that this guy was a brilliant organizer. And the Beatles were always the best at what they did, but they had no idea how to organize themselves. They needed someone to come in and shape their direction for them, to actually show them the way to go and to open up the doors. And he did it.
Now, the Beatles that we know that Brian Epstein took to the toppermost, to the poppermost, were John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Yeah.
But initially, when Brian went down those steps of the Cavern in Liverpool and saw the band, there was another drummer there.
Yeah.
I know it's hard to put it into a nutshell, but sort of the story of Pete Best. Of how
Well, yeah, the Beatles always had a problem with getting a drummer. In fact, there was a period in 1960 when Paul was the drummer. So they were a four-piece with Paul on drums, but that was always really frustrating for Paul because he wanted to be out front. So by a miracle of coincidences, they end up getting offered this trip to Hamburg in Germany. And they must go as a five-piece, and it's quite clear that they need to get one more guy, and it's going to have to be a drummer because that was what they always lacked. And they knew that there was this kid in Liverpool with a drum kit and no particular day-to-day job, so they grabbed him, and his name was Pete Best. And Pete Best was their drummer until pretty much the eve of their breakthrough in the UK. And then he was fired, and then poor guy had to watch while the Beatles became the biggest thing that entertainment had ever known. I mean, they were hoping to have a hit record or two, but, you know, they actually kind of changed the world.
Did a bit better than that,
yeah. Yeah. And we're still talking about them 50 years later, and he's just been having to watch it for 50 years.
Right.
So that was all quite unfortunate.
But you do in the book, though, just to, you do explain the story.
Well,
and
yeah,
how it all happened, and you'll see that the myth.
Well, the Beatles story is one that attracts a lot of myths.
Yes.
It's inevitable because everyone thinks they know something of it, and things get magnified and things get told out of proportion. So one of the things is, why did they fire Pete Best? And for some reason, it's been a mystery for 50 years as to why they should fire this guy.
Even to him.
So he says. So he says. But actually, it's quite clear when you read the book. And it isn't me saying it, it's all the people I talk to. Because I have interviewed hundreds of people who were witnesses to all these events. And it's absolutely clear that he was never really one of them. And if you're in a band and the chemistry isn't right, then you know it, right? I mean, you're in a band, you know these things. You've got to have the chemistry right. And especially if the front line are so full of personality and so full of exuberance and character, and the guy on the drums is making no eye contact. He's a very shy individual, Pete. Just looks down, doesn't make any eye contact, doesn't smile, doesn't speak to anyone. And after the gig, he just goes home, and the other three hang out together. Well, there's a divide there, right? And every time they played with Ringo, who was part of this same scene, he was in another band, it felt great. They just immediately thought, this is the guy.
And Paul you said Paul played drums for a while, but Paul was actually the best guitarist in the Beatles, wasn't he, for a while?
Paul is pretty good musically at anything he picks up. I mean, he's just one of those guys who can pick up any instrument and that's it. He's away. And that can make life difficult in a band when ultimately in the Beatles he's saying to Ringo, no, I could do, let me show you.
Yeah.
Because obviously you've got to be aware of the chemistry of the personalities.
But he ended up playing bass guitar. But
By
during
default.
Hamburg, right, who was playing bass in Hamburg?
Well, they had another guy called Stuart Sutcliffe.
Right.
The Beatles were originally a 5-piece, not a 4. And Stuart was brilliant, a brilliant artist, not so much a brilliant bass player, but a brilliant artist. And he gave the Beatles an image and a look that was very important to their development. And he also attracted in Germany, in Hamburg, 3 bright young things who were primarily attracted to Stuart first, who Astrid, Klaus and Jürgen, who had a great influence on the Beatles. And that's an interesting story too, because they were all war babies as well, Astrid, Klaus and Jürgen. And they were so disgusted with their country's behavior that they grew up after the war absolutely appalled to be German because of what their country had done. And so they shunned everything German and embraced everything French. So the Beatles went to Hamburg as young English guys with Irish backgrounds singing black American music and got to Hamburg to meet 3 people who were totally influenced by Paris, and the Beatles became this mélange of all of that. And when they really broke America, they had a continental look, not an English look, and certainly not an American look. They were kind of French.
You just talk about myths in the Beatles. Your book has separated some of the myths from and showing the truth. What myths bother you about the Beatles?
So many. I have real difficulty reading most books on the Beatles, especially those that have got an agenda. The writers often have an agenda on something, and they bring that agenda onto the page, and they're forcing their opinions on you. And for me, it's just about being the narrator, and I just try and weave other stories together in this book. Myths that bother me. Just too many aspects of their story are they're too pat. These are very interesting, challenging, spiky, difficult, funny, talented, amusing, original people. And I just think that you can't easily put a thought on them because they were much more diverse than that. So I really need to I look in this book at the Beatles from the outside in and the inside out. And I want to see their chemistry with one another and how they functioned as a unit. I mean, how did these 4 guys stay so sane through such insane times once they became so globally popular? So I look at all that, but there are so many elements of the story that are too easy, like when they go to India, for example, and they're with the Maharishi, which is often just kind of thrown away as this kind of, this silly period in their career when they just went off to India and, tried to levitate or whatever. But in reality, these guys, they're just guys. They're human beings who are going through an extraordinary time, and they're having to deal with what fame is bringing them. Fame on an unimagined scale. No one had ever been as big as the Beatles. They are the ever-present royalty of all celebrity. To this day, you go in a room full of celebrities, Paul McCartney walks in, they will all turn to look at him. He is the tops. And they all were. The same was true of John and George, and it's still true of Ringo. So they had to deal with this. So at the ages of 25, 26, 27, 28, they decided to go and find out what life was about. To take that journey. But being the Beatles, it became a very, very public thing. It should have been a private thing, but it became very public, and everyone took the mickey out of them for it, and they became kind of the laughing stock. But they needed to find out who they were to discover themselves, and when they came back, they were different from before they went. So what happened there in India is worthy of proper look. It's not just to be tossed away as something silly. It's like, this is important. If those guys thought it was important, it's important. And at the same time, being the Beatles, wherever they went, everyone followed. This whole business of people being interested in meditation, people being interested in spiritualism and Eastern philosophy and so on, that existed for centuries before the Beatles, but they are the great popularizers of it. Because they did it, it became a possibility for everybody else.
Now, to be fair, 1968 is going to be in volume 3.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got to wait a
That's
little
a
bit
while
for that
away.
one.
Yeah.
This only goes up to the New Year's Eve 62,
This
right?
goes up to the very brink of 1963,
right.
when the Beatles have got a record out in England. They're already being exposed to the American market. They've already been turned down by, at the end of this book, 3 American record companies, because America was no more prepared to accept what the Beatles were than the English market was. They had to force their way in, but once people heard them, that was enough, because the music did the rest.
Now, let's talk about their idols, because we talked about the music a little bit. Who were the Beatles idolizing for American musicians?
Elvis, 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 Elvis.
Was it Elvis?
Absolutely, it was Elvis.
I thought.
Yeah, Elvis Costello was really big in those days. Elvis, and also very much Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and very much Eddie Cochran, and very much Jerry Lee Lewis, and very much Carl Perkins, Little Richard, of course, Little Richard. It didn't matter to them what skin colour the person had, because it was music. And John Lennon had this extraordinary experience when he was 15. Yes, it was April 1956. He had just heard Elvis, and Elvis was the greatest thing he had ever heard in his entire life. And John Lennon would always love Elvis till the day he died. And then some kids in his class at school had been on a school trip to the Netherlands, and been in a record store there and bought a Little Richard 78. Now, Little Richard was not available in the UK at this point, not until about 8 months later. And this guy called Michael Hill had a record with Long Tall Sally on one side and Slippin' and Slidin' on the other, a 78. And said to John during the course of a school morning, I've got a record at home by a guy who's probably better than Elvis. And John, who had only heard of Elvis for about a month, said, not possible. Would have told him it in 2 short words, no doubt, what he thought of that idea. But at lunchtime, they all bunked out of school, went and got a bag of chips, French fries, back to this guy Michael's house, put on the record, and John Lennon heard Long Tall Sally for the first time and was completely stupefied and torn, because he loved Elvis, and yet he loved this guy as well. And then someone said to him that Little Richard was a Negro, as the word was then, black, African American, and it was like, oh my God, they make this music too, I love it. And they became totally passionate about black American music from that moment onwards.
And to this day, if you ask Little Richard, he says he influenced Paul McCartney all the time, doesn't he? He'll tell you firsthand, I did.
He does, and they eventually got to play with Little Richard, and for them meeting Little Richard was like anybody else meeting them. It was like, them and their heroes.
What were the first songs that John and Paul wrote?
Together, well, first of all, they wrote separately.
Right.
And this is one of so many amazing things in this book. There were hardly any boys in the south end of Liverpool where they were growing up. Liverpool's a big city, so it has a north end and a south end. It doesn't have a west end, because that's the river, but it has an east. And they lived in the south end of the city, and John Lennon started writing songs in 1957 at the age of 16. His first song was called Calypso Rock. Because, as I said, America believed that rock and roll was this 5-minute thing, and we in England, who swallowed everything that you thought it would last 5 minutes as well. So it was going to last 5 minutes, and it was preserved only by the kids, because the companies were already trying to say, well, here's the next fad, and the next fad was going to be calypso music. So if you read Billboard or Cashbox of Variety of 1957, you'll read Calypso is the coming thing, rock and roll is dead. And that filtered across to England, so John Lennon thought, if I'm going to write a song, I'll try and straddle the two things. So he wrote a song called Calypso Rock.
Wow.
And then he wrote a song called Hello Little Girl, Hello Little Girl. And Paul at the same time, and this is where it gets interesting, he was writing a song called I Lost My Little Girl at the same time. So before they met, or around the time they met, they were both individually writing songs. So what are the chances of two kids writing songs? Paul was only 14. What are the chances of them writing songs and then finding each other and then thinking, let's write together. So unusual were the Beatles in those days that when Brian Epstein was trying to get them a recording contract in London, not only were people telling them you'll never make it from Liverpool and you know, go home and all that kind of stuff, everyone said to him, you've got to change the name because the word Beatles will never catch on. Never catch on. So, you know, as weird as that sounds, that is the thinking back in 1962. And the Beatles were always about, stuff you, we're going to do it our way, and if you don't like it, we'll just keep it, and you'll pay for it later. And when they first went to London, there's a section in the book when they go to London for the first time to promote themselves, and they go around meeting journalists. People were openly hostile to them. You know, your name is horrible, and you'll never make it, and all that. And they, being the Beatles, they thought, right, we'll show you. And they never forgot. I mean, very tough-minded guys, the Beatles. Very tough.
But they had a little bit of trouble with the name in Germany too, didn't they?
There's a leading question.
I had to ask it.
In Germany, the word Beatles will be pronounced as Pedals.
Not to end on a naughty note, but...
and Pedals actually means the male appendage in German, in some kind of slightly schoolboyish talk. Actually, I quite like the fact that in America, you always say Beatles with like it's got a D. We say Beatles with a T, but we say Elvis wrong. Well, Presley, because we say Presley as if it's got what I would call a Z and you call a Z, and you say Presley. So we name your greatest star incorrectly. We pronounce it wrong, and you pronounce our greatest.
Actually,
star
we don't even say the last name. We just call him Elvis.
Yeah,
The king.
What's Madonna's last name?
I can't think.
Just kidding.
Cuccione.
Yeah, wow.
Sorry.
Someone Google it right now.
Ciccone.
No, well, you know, there's so much to talk about in this book. I mean, it's 1,000 pages. It really is. It does go up to 62. You really need to buy it and read it. It's the most incredible detail you will ever read on the Beatles. It really does put into context who they were, why they became who they did, and why they gelled, as you said, why they gelled as ultimately John, Paul, George, and Ringo. It was John, Paul, George, and Pete, or drummer, or undesirable member, as you're reading here. I mean, and then it became Ringo.
And that order is important.
Yeah.
Psychologically, the constitution of the Beatles as a band is John, Paul, George, and Ringo, because John started it and led them, and he was always the leader.
Right.
And he brought in Paul, and Paul brought in George, and George brought in Ringo. So that is doesn't just fall nicely off the tongue. It's absolutely essential to understanding the relationships within the group.
Yeah.
And just to add, you know, one of the fascinating things about the book is that it's written in a narrative form, and you see sort of how different people could have, you know, there were some near misses of people who weave in and out of the Beatles' lives at different times.
Yeah.
So many instances of things could have been radically different if one domino had been slightly out of place.
Yeah.
And, you know, while other books you'd see a little of that, because you have it so beautifully laid out, you really do see the if you want to say fate or just the circumstances that put it all together. Brilliantly done.
Yeah.
Well, I also think just a little review of the book, you look at the bigger circle as well as the inner circle. I think, you know, the people like Brian Epstein, you don't start where we first meet the Beatles, it's before that.
Right.
George Martin, and other people,
Yeah.
you know, who managed them or
In the sphere.
in quotes.
Well,
You know.
I don't see that. To me, it's always wrong when you get a book where, for example, Ringo joins the Beatles in '62. So most of the books on the Beatles will have their entire story to that point and then bring him in and do a little quick backstory, and that's it. But actually, all these people are growing up in the same city at the same time. Yeah. They're all living there. They're all on parallel tracks that sometimes cross over before they really have met. And I wanted this to be, this is not a book about legends. This is a book about four people who thought differently and acted differently and were original and daring and prepared to break all the rules. So it's really important to actually put them properly all in the same space at the same time, and because they're all going to see the same films at the same time in the cinema, the Elvis films or whatever, and they're all listening to the same records, and they are crossing over one another even before they know it. So it makes it much more of a cogent and real story if you've actually got them in the same place at the same time.
And also the fact that they also met the right people who believed in them.
Yeah.
Brian Epstein, George Martin. If they were signed to Decca,
they were lucky to get Brian Epstein as their manager. They were extraordinarily lucky to get George Martin as their producer, and he, in turn, was extraordinarily lucky to get them. Because as I show in the book, he didn't actually want to sign them. He actually had his arm twisted to sign them. But as soon as he met them, because he signed them before he met them, as soon as he met them, he knew that they were original. And he worked really. George Martin's career fell into two paths, really, which was if he ever followed a formula and did whatever the formulaic thing to do was with unoriginal talent, the records were really quite poor. And I have a collection of them now. George Martin's poor records. There's a box full of them. But if he ever worked with original minds, people who were really creative in their own right, he would bring all his creativity to the palette as well, and the results were fantastic. So meeting the Beatles for George was just the most perfect thing, because they were their thing was always, what do you mean we can't do that? You know, it's just like, what do you mean no? Yeah. Well, if you say no, we'll say yes. You know, as the song goes.
Yeah.
But, you know, that actually is Paul McCartney's mantra to this day. You say yes, I'll say no, or you say no, I'll say yes. And the Beatles always operated that way. As soon as they got to Abbey Road Studios and they met a sheet of paper full of rules like that, they went, well, we're going to do that, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do that, and they just broke them all. And because they broke them all, they made Sgt. Pepper and Revolver and Abbey Road and the White Album and all these things that were just, you know, culturally pushing the envelope so far.
Yeah. Well, I want to open it up to questions in the audience, but I will say, as far as the narrative in the book, you do get a sense when you read this that you are in their story, and that's, I think, one of the biggest compliments I can pay you, because I felt like I was actually walking down the street with John, with George, with Ringo and Paul, and you really were there with them. And that has not happened before in any other book I've read.
Yeah.
So, I mean, kudos. It is a really fascinating book. Really
Thank
is.
you.
To bring in the Ruddles humor, you brought in the sights, the sounds, the smells of the actual. And you'll read about that in the book. There's actually a comment about the smells.
So do we have any questions from the audience? From Mark? Sure.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for writing this book. As one of the only people in the room who probably saw the Ed Sullivan Show the first time it was shown, and my father said that can't be their real hair, it became sort of a genetic piece of my fabric, of growing up, my culture, my background. And I wonder if the same sort of feeling happens with any other artist later on. Is there another generation that has another artist that becomes so genetic in their core being, or is this a once in a lifetime, once in a generation, once in a millennium thing?
Well, I'll throw this one open to the panel here, but from my own point of view, I mean, the obvious answer is that every generation has its heroes, and every generation has its key musical influences. I always think that it's the music you hear when you're, say, 14 to 19 or 20 that has the greatest impacts on you in terms of shaping your opinion. But on the other hand, subsequent generations wouldn't have had anything as profound as the Beatles or as artistically deep and satisfying as the Beatles. Molds can really only be broken once. I mean, there are so many molds to be broken, but the Beatles just, they changed so many things that after that, everyone was in a way always treading in their footsteps. But of course, if you asked an 18-year-old today, though he might know of the Beatles, which is an amazing thing in itself, that wouldn't necessarily be his or her game changer. But that's what I feel.
Well, you know, to me, Dexy's Midnight Runner with Come On Eileen. No, I mean,
great record.
There's no one like Dexy's Midnight Runner. No, to me, you're asking the wrong person, because to me, I'm up here because of the Beatles. Well, I'm up here because of my parents, but I'm up here really because the Beatles were a big influence on my life. I don't think there's anybody, you have always said that there were circumstances that made the Beatles who they were, and I don't think those can happen again.
Yeah.
I just don't.
They were born at the right time, and they entered our lives at the right time as well.
Yeah.
I think some bands have had a place in rock history.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think culturally, in the bigger picture, the Beatles, knocked
can
down
happen.
so many doors and stuff.
I think, there was always this thing about who's going to be the next band to be as big as the Beatles. And after about 30 years, eventually people stopped asking because it just isn't possible. Times have moved on.
I think actually the
But
curse.
there's no Ed Sullivan show either.
Well, I was
Oh,
just going to
that's
say,
true.
I think part of it has to do with the idea that the Ed Sullivan Show was such a huge simultaneous exposure. I think that there have been acts since then. You read about Elton John's performance at the Troubadour that broke him wide open. U2 had some stunning performances, but these were often live performances that were reviewed. Springsteen being called the future of rock and roll. We saw it in individual performances that would get reviewed, but to have had it given to all of us on the Sullivan Show, here it is. It was,
And how many bands got started the next day because of the Ed Sullivan show?
Yeah.
Show.
Well, it's funny because I feel bad for Elvis, because Elvis probably thought the same thing. Well, no one's going to be bigger than me. And then a few years later, it's the Beatles. It's like, oh, damn.
I do have a question for you, Mark, and it concerns the Sullivan Show. Here in America, it's a moment.
Yeah.
In Great Britain, you didn't have the Ed Sullivan Show as a broadcast there.
didn't
How
see
is
it,
that
yeah.
looked at from Great Britain?
Well, I used to read about the Ed Sullivan Show for years as a Beatles fan, and also I was always interested in broadcasting as well. But I didn't actually see it until the video age, when you could actually get to see tapes of things.
Right.
For us, that was not the show. For us, we had our own landmark moments. A couple of big TV shows the Beatles did. But more than anything else, whereas the Beatles, well, they were number one at the time of the Sullivan Show here.
Yes, they were.
But that was where the nation saw them for the first time. In England, it happened a few months earlier, and it mostly happened through the records and radio. And then people saw them on television and thought they were great.
Right.
We didn't have that one single defining moment like you've had here. Yeah.
Okay.
We have a next question from Mark Lewisohn. We should just tell everybody that Mark Lewisohn is the founder of what was known as Beatle Fest in 1974 and since changed to the Fest for Beatles fans. And Mark Lewisohn is going to be a guest. If you want to tell people about that after your question.
Sure. First of all, there are other people here who were there for the Ed Sullivan. And it's a little-known fact that to this day, it's the largest audience in the history of American television by population size.
Right.
So the
Right.
population was like 160. So it's like, I think 42%, something like that. And Super Bowl never gets more than 33%, I don't think.
Right.
So that Ed Sullivan Show, even, as George said, of course, many times, even the criminals stayed home to watch us. But anyway, I have a question. I have no idea if you're writing about this because this book only goes up to the end of 62, and I'm only up to like page 50 or 60. It's going to take me maybe 10 years to get through it, but I'm loving it so far. I don't know how much you delve into the music part of it, but I guess for book 3, I have a bit of Beatles trivia I'd like to ask you about. I asked George Martin, and he answered it, but I want to know if you know about this, what your answer would be. Penny Lane, I met with him about 20 years ago. I said, can I ask you one trivia question? He said, sure. I said, what happened at the end of Penny Lane? Why is it only on the promotional single in the U.S.? So do you have the answer, Mark?
Why?
Just let people know what
the-
they're...
No.
You mean the trumpet ending?
The trumpet,
The trumpet ending.
The trumpet ending. It's only on the promotional single. It never made it on the American single or album.
Did he tell you it was because Paul wanted to change it at the last minute?
No.
What did he tell you?
I'll give you an answer in a minute. But
Well, now we know what the
I
answer
just
is.
Now we know the answer.
This is exactly what he said. He said, we were just making music. We just sent it over. It's like, he didn't even know it. He was like, all right, we'll send it over. Oh, it's not finished. It doesn't matter. Just do it. Never gave it a thought.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
surprised the hell out of me.
They were turning out product. I mean, that is another amazing thing about the Beatles is that all the recorded material that we know and love all came out in the space of about 7.5 years. 13 albums in 7.5 years. If you're looking at the UK product, which is the way they shaped it, and all those singles and other tracks as well. I mean, 200 odd tracks in 7 years. An act these days would probably do 1 or 2 albums
Yeah.
Yeah,
in that
Sure.
time.
probably.
And they completely wiped clean and drew again the face of popular music in that period. One of the things I do in this book is I actually number all the years. So 1958 is really the year when the Beatles are first. They're not the Beatles yet, but in fact they went around as a trio at one point, John, Paul and George, called J-Page 3.
It was a new discovery. That was
Yeah.
something that had never surfaced
Yeah.
before. Where did you find
Well,
that?
I just tracked down this guy who was actually their manager for a while and had a recording of them that he wiped, unfortunately. But they were J-Page 3, J for John, PA for Paul, and GE for George, and 3 because they were a trio, 3 guitarists. And that is year one. 1958, when they start going around together, is year one. So 1964, when they played the Sullivan Show, that's year 7. You know, there is a tendency in America to think they kind of arrived when they played the Sullivan Show, but that was year 7, and when they broke up, it was year 13. Now, they don't get a recording contract till year 5, but that doesn't mean they're not together. They're still, you know, very much working and finding out who they are, and young lads having fun and all that, and having adventures. But so actually, they were together 13 years, much more than people realise.
And we did want to say that Mark will be at the Fest for Beatles fans on the Sunday, February 9th, correct?
The anniversary of the Sullivan Show.
Absolutely. So look.
I should be doing my Ed Sullivan impressions.
Oh, good. I'll be doing my Topo Gigio impersonation. I'm short enough. So, do we have any other questions for Mark?
We're being told to wrap it up.
We're being told to wrap it up. But one more question? Anybody? Al?
Actually, I did have one.
Can you go to the mic, please?
Okay.
Sorry. And then I believe Mark will be doing signing.
Oh,
We don't? I'm sorry, Al.
We can ask it in private out.
Yeah, ask it in private, Al. Sorry.
Okay,
We'll ask it after.
real quick.
Oh, sorry.
Mark, you talked about the hostility that the London music establishment had toward Liverpool.
Yes.
Or indifference, maybe. And yet there was, in that first batch of teen idols, there was one Liverpudlian, Billy Fury.
Yes.
But he didn't apparently become sort of an icon for the other, you know, budding musicians in Liverpool. Was there a particular reason for that?
Yeah, Billy Fury was the first Liverpool rock and roll star before the Beatles. His real name was Ronald Wycherley, and he actually was in the same class at school as Ringo. But so embarrassing was the Liverpool accent, or perceived to be in those days in the UK, and that's another thing the Beatles did. In my country, in England, they completely changed the class system. Well, not changed it, but challenged it, and opened it up to people, because they had northern working class accents, and that had always been embarrassing before. Billy Fury was never said a word publicly because of his Liverpool accent. His manager said to him, "Don't speak." And when he sang in an American voice, so no one really knew he was from Liverpool. It wasn't important. But when the Beatles broke through, it's like, yeah, we're from Liverpool, we're from the north. You got a problem with that? And, you know, that was a real challenge to people, and which is why they received hostility to begin with. But eventually, within about a year, everyone was putting on a northern accent to be cool. I mean, that's just a small measure of the impact that they had.
Well, the book is called The Beatles All These Years. Tune in, Volume 1. There will be 3 of these by Crown Archetype. Thank you very much. We appreciate Mark being here. We appreciate Google having us here.
Thank you.